In the heart of the 1849 California gold rush, a single egg cost the modern equivalent of $100. Picture a man standing in a wooden shack, the mud of the Sierra Nevada mountains caked so deeply into his skin that it looks like a second layer of clothing. He is shivering. His hands are calloused, cracked, and trembling as he reaches into a small leather pouch. He pulls out a tiny, gleaming speck of pure gold, a piece of the earth he spent 14 agonizing hours waist-deep in a freezing river to extract. He places this speck onto a brass scale. He watches the heavy metal tip the balance, and in exchange for this physical manifestation of human exhaustion, the merchant hands him one single, uncracked egg. That is exactly why the true story of the 1849 California gold rush is not a triumphant tale of pioneer wealth and adventure. It is a horrifying masterclass in the ruthless mechanics of hyperinflation. When word reached the East Coast that the rivers of San Francisco were practically glowing with precious metals, a frenzy erupted that fundamentally broke the rules of basic economics. The math was merciless. You had tens of thousands of desperate men flooding into a territory that produced absolutely nothing edible. The realization that having a fortune in your hands doesn't mean a single thing if you cannot eat it is a psychological terror most modern minds cannot comprehend. Imagine your pockets being heavier than they have ever been in your entire life. Imagine holding the equivalent of a modern tech CEO's daily salary in the palm of your filthy hand, while your stomach screams in a pitch-black agony, twisting itself into knots because you haven't consumed a calorie in 2 days. What would you trade for your next meal if your stomach was screaming, but all you had were shiny rocks? Tell me what your survival limit is in the comments. But before they could even face this brutal economic math, they had to survive a journey that was mathematically designed to bury them. Getting to the gold wasn't just hard, it was a statistical death sentence. To truly grasp the suffocating terror of this era, you have to completely erase the modern map of the United States from your mind. There was no transcontinental railroad waiting to whisk eager prospectors across the plains. There were no highways, no telegraph lines, and absolutely no infrastructure to support the sudden, violent migration of humanity toward the West Coast. Because of this extreme geographic isolation, entering California required a man to willingly submit himself to one of 3 agonizing ordeals. He could brave the Overland Trail, a brutal trek across hostile deserts and towering mountains where cholera wiped out entire wagon trains in a matter of days. However, the maritime routes were far darker. Men packed themselves into rotting ships, choosing either to sail down to the suffocating, mosquito-ridden jungles of the Panama crossing or to navigate the terrifying, icy isolation of Cape Horn. The Panama route promised a shortcut, forcing men to hike through a tropical hellscape where yellow fever turned healthy lungs into heavy, useless organs. The Cape Horn route meant months trapped in the freezing, violent swells of the southernmost ocean, locked in a wooden box where the diet of salted meat and stale water slowly eroded their immune systems. You survived the storms and the disease thinking the worst is over, only to realize you were now trapped at the end of the world. The psychological toll of this journey was immeasurable. These men left behind weeping wives, confused children, and empty chairs at dinner tables back east, trading the warmth of their families for a delusional gamble in the dirt. Imagine kissing your family goodbye, knowing the odds of seeing them again are less than a coin flip. Would you step onto that boat for a chance at generational wealth? Let me know below. They dragged their broken bodies ashore, believing they had won the lottery, completely unaware they had just walked into an invisible cage. Part 3. The Curse of the Full Pan. The sound of gold nuggets hitting a tin pan was the sweetest music a man could hear, until he realized it was the sound of his own doom. At first glance, the riverbeds of the Sierra Nevada looked like a mythological paradise, a place where the dirt literally sparkled with the promise of eternal financial freedom. The initial adrenaline rush of spotting that heavy yellow glint beneath the freezing water was a narcotic that kept men working in a frantic, obsessive frenzy. They would plunge their bare hands into the snowmelt runoff for 10, 12, sometimes 16 hours a day, numb to the bone, driven solely by the primal desire to accumulate more. But underneath the surface of this newfound wealth lurked a terrifying lesson in the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic value. Gold, for all its mesmerizing beauty and societal weight, possesses absolutely zero caloric value. You cannot eat it, you cannot drink it, and it will not keep the freezing wind from biting through a wet wool blanket. That is when the panic sets in. Picture a miner sitting in the mud outside a canvas tent. He has a leather pouch holding 10 pounds of pure, unadulterated gold. By the standards of the world he left behind, he is a king. Yet, as he stares at his fortune, he realizes his gums are painfully swollen, his teeth are loosening from his skull due to profound malnutrition. His muscles are shrinking, cannibalizing themselves just to keep his heart beating. He is officially a millionaire on paper, but he is poorer than a beggar back in New York. The absolute uselessness of his fortune begins to crush his spirit, mocking his sacrifice and turning his triumph into a slow, agonizing tragedy. The rivers were choked with rich men who were fading away into absolute nothingness. And while the miners were staring at their useless fortunes, the true architects of this nightmare were already counting their real wealth. Part 4. The Predators Behind the Counter. The real kings of 1849 never lifted a shovel, never waded into a freezing river, and never touched a pan. Enter the mastermind of the California Gold Rush, a man named Sam Brannan who understood a fundamental truth about human greed that the prospectors entirely missed. This wasn't luck, it was a calculated trap meticulously engineered to drain the wealth from the very people breaking their backs in the wilderness. Before anyone else truly comprehended the scale of the discovery at Sutter's Mill, Brannan made a move that would cement him as the ultimate predator of the era. He didn't rush to the river to dig in the dirt alongside the desperate masses. He rushed to every single general store, warehouse, and trading post in the region, quietly purchasing every shovel, pickaxe, and pan he could find. Only after he held an absolute monopoly on the basic tools of survival did he run through the streets of San Francisco, waving a vial of gold and screaming the news to anyone who would listen. The trap was set perfectly. Now picture the sheer agonizing humiliation of the average miner trapped within this ruthless economic system. A man works 14 exhausting hours in the biting cold, his fingers numb, his back screaming in agony from the repetitive motion of sifting heavy, wet dirt. He finds a few precious flakes of gold, a tiny victory against the unforgiving landscape, but to continue his work, to merely survive another week in the wild, he is forced to walk into a dry, warm mercantile. He steps up to a clean wooden counter, and there stands a man with immaculate clothes and soft, uncalloused hands, charging an astronomical markup for a simple piece of stamped metal. Brannan didn't sell gold, he sold the desperate illusion of it to dying men. Every single ounce of suffering endured in the icy water was ultimately transferred into the pockets of men who never once risked their lives. The miners were not pioneers conquering a new frontier, they were indentured servants to a retail monopoly they couldn't escape. But a monopoly on shovels was just the beginning. The real extortion started when the human body began to break down. Part 5. The Economics of Agony. A slice of bread, a pair of boots, a single drop of medicine, each carried a price tag that would make a modern billionaire flinch. To understand this economic nightmare, you have to look at the terrifying mathematics of a city spiraling completely out of control. Picture this scenario. The population of San Francisco violently exploded from a sleepy settlement of 1,000 souls to a chaotic, desperate mob of 25,000 people in a matter of mere months. The math is merciless. Demand surged by thousands of percent, while the supply chain remained stubbornly tethered to wooden ships that were still thousands of miles away, creeping slowly around the southern tip of the continent. The result was a hyper-inflated economy that punished the vulnerable with a brutality that defies modern logic. A basic blanket, normally costing a few cents, suddenly commanded a king's ransom. A bottle of clean, unpolluted water became a luxury item guarded like a precious gem. Imagine the agonizing transaction taking place in the mind of a miner standing inside a dimly lit general store. He looks down at his rotting leather boots, the soles cracked open, exposing his bruised and freezing feet to the toxic, infectious mud of the camp. His throat is dangerously dry, and a persistent cough rattles deep within his chest. He holds a small pouch of gold dust, the physical result of a month of back-breaking labor. Do I send this gold back to my starving children, or do I buy a blanket so I don't freeze in the mud tonight? It is a psychological torture device disguised as a free market. Every purchase was a literal calculation of mortality, forcing men to weigh their immediate survival against the promises they made to the families they left behind. If you were standing in that freezing mud, holding a single gold nugget, would you buy the boots for yourself or risk the frostbite to send the money home? Tell me what your gut says. Yet, even if you could afford the boots and the bread, there was a silent assassin in the camps that money almost couldn't cure. Part 6. The Silent Tax of the Mountains. It wasn't a bear and it wasn't a bandit that haunted the camps. It was a biological killer that turned strong young men into ghosts. It crept in quietly, disguising itself as the natural fatigue that comes from living a harsh life in an unforgiving wilderness. The first sign was profound, unshakable exhaustion. A miner would wake up in his damp canvas tent, telling himself he just needed one more hour of sleep, unable to understand why his limbs felt like they were forged from solid lead. But then came the terrifying reality of a body actively unweaving itself from the inside out. This was scurvy. It was the result of a catastrophic, long-term, severe deficiency of vitamin C, a nutrient entirely absent from their daily rations of salted pork and stale hardtack biscuits. Without the fresh produce they had left behind in the civilized world, their biology simply stopped functioning correctly. We must look at the tragic consequences of this cellular failure to understand the true horror of the camps without relying on cheap shock value. Men who had crossed oceans and deserts now found themselves staggering through the mud, their eyes hollow and unfocused, their once powerful frames reduced to fragile silhouettes. Heavy iron pickaxes were dropped in the dirt, abandoned permanently because the hands that wielded them could no longer muster the grip strength to hold a wooden handle. The ultimate irony? Having a fortune buried beneath your tent while your own body slowly shuts down from the inside. There was no grand battle, no dramatic final stand against an enemy you could shoot, stab, or outrun. It was a slow, silent surrender to the harsh reality of human biology placed in an environment it was never meant to endure for long periods. The camps became wards of the walking dead, filled with millionaires who could not summon the energy to stand up. The cure existed, but to get it, you had to surrender every last ounce of your dignity and your gold for a meal that bordered on the absurd. Part 7. The $100 Hangtown Fry. A filthy, exhausted miner walks into a saloon, slams down a bag of pure gold, and demands the most expensive thing they can cook. This wasn't just a meal, it was a statement of survival, a desperate psychological need to feel human again after months of living like a feral animal in the freezing mud. The bartender doesn't offer him salted pork or hardtack. Instead, he offers a culinary masterpiece born entirely from the hyperinflated chaos of the era, the legendary Hangtown Fry. Here is how this absurd dish was forged. The ingredients themselves required a logistical miracle that drove the price to astronomical heights. Fresh oysters had to be packed into barrels of icy seawater and painstakingly transported by rattling wooden wagons from the distant coast. Thick slabs of heavily salted bacon were hauled over treacherous mountain passes, and the crowning jewel, the eggs, were fiercely guarded by local farmers who understood they possessed a commodity far rarer than the yellow dust choking the rivers. Picture the sensory explosion occurring in that dimly lit room. The exhausted miner sits at a rough-hewn table, his clothes stiff with dried clay, his body trembling from profound caloric deficit. He watches the iron skillet heat up over an open flame. He hears the violent, aggressive sizzle of the bacon fat melting against the black metal. The heavy, intoxicating smoke fills the saloon, entirely masking the foul stench of unwashed bodies and damp wool. The oysters are dropped into the bubbling grease, followed by the gentle, deliberate cracking of the $100 eggs. The sheer, overwhelming smell of fresh protein hits the miner's brain like a physical blow. For that one fleeting, greasy moment, paying $100 for an egg didn't feel like robbery. It felt like salvation. He isn't paying for the ingredients. He is purchasing a temporary escape from the psychological torture of the mountains. He is buying the feeling of civilization, tasting the luxury of a world he left behind, proving to himself that his agonizing sacrifices in the freezing rivers actually meant something tangible. But the grease had barely faded from their lips when a new, far more permanent reality began to crush the camps. Part 8. The Psychological Collapse. The surface gold vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind a terrifying silence where the dream used to be. The era of the lone prospector was dead. Replaced by machines, the entire ecosystem of the California wilderness underwent a brutal industrial transformation that completely shattered the romantic illusion of the individual pioneer. The easy pickings, the loose flakes waiting patiently in the shallow riverbeds were entirely stripped away within a few chaotic years. To understand this shift, you must visualize the terrifying scale of the new operations. Giant, deafening hydraulic water cannons were dragged up the mountainsides. These corporate-owned mechanical monsters literally blasted the ancient hills into muddy oblivion, washing away entire landscapes to extract the deeply buried veins of quartz and gold. Capital ruthlessly replaced labor. The lone man with his tin pan and his desperate hope was mathematically eliminated from the game, completely unable to compete with the terrifying efficiency of industrial engineering. Leaving behind only shame, the miners found themselves trapped in a psychological prison entirely of their own making. Picture a broken man sitting in a freezing, leaky canvas tent at midnight. He has a stub of a candle flickering in the freezing draft. His fingers are so crippled by arthritis and frostbite that he can barely hold a pen. He is writing a letter to a wife he hasn't seen in 3 years. He stares at the blank parchment, the weight of his absolute failure pressing down on his chest like a physical stone. He lies. He writes that the claim is looking promising, that he just needs 1 more month, that he will be coming home a rich man very soon. The hardest thing wasn't surviving the mountains, it was surviving the lie you had to tell your family. The crushing depression of the camps became far more deadly than cholera or scurvy. These men were financially ruined, physically destroyed, and deeply humiliated by a system that had chewed them up and spit them out into the dirt. The individuals were broken, and soon the very earth they had torn apart would take its revenge on the towns they built. Part 9. The Skeletons of Greed. Boom towns built on a foundation of pure greed decayed into ghost towns the moment the riverbeds ran dry. It happened overnight. Without the gold flowing from the dirt into the pockets of the exhausted miners, the incredibly fragile secondary economy instantly collapsed upon itself. The facade crumbled with a speed that defies belief. These settlements were never designed to be permanent bastions of civilization. They were parasitic outposts constructed hastily out of cheap, unseasoned pine and canvas, designed solely to extract maximum capital in minimum time. When the primary resource vanished, there was absolutely no foundational industry, no agriculture, and no civic infrastructure to keep the towns breathing. You must picture the eerie, unnatural desolation that swept through the valleys like a silent plague. Saloons that just weeks prior had roared with the deafening symphony of drunken laughter, clinking glasses, and the occasional sharp crack of a revolver now stood entirely abandoned. Half-finished games of cards were left rotting on dusty tables. The heavy wooden doors of the mercantile shops, once guarded fiercely by men like Sam Brannan, simply blew open in the freezing wind, their hinges screaming in the agonizing silence. The gold dried up. The merchants packed up, the towns gave up. The rapid decay of something built so frantically is a haunting visual. Roofs collapsed under the heavy weight of the winter snows, crushing the empty bars and the dry goods stores beneath tons of white ice. The untamed wilderness of the Sierra Nevada mountains immediately began to reclaim the territory, sending crawling vines and deep roots through the floorboards, pulling the wooden skeletons back into the mud. It was a total erasure of human ambition. The vibrant, chaotic epicenter of the greatest wealth migration in human history was reduced to a scattering of rotting timber swaying mournfully in the valley breeze. But the most terrifying part of this 19th century ghost story isn't that it happened, it's that we are walking into the exact same trap today. Part 10. The Invisible Arteries of Wealth. But history is never as simple as a pile of bleached bones in the desert. While the mountains were busy breaking men, a far more sophisticated and invisible machine was being forged in the chaos. The gold didn't just sit in stagnant puddles in the mud. It began to flow through the veins of a dying nation like a high-voltage current. We must look past the individual tragedy to see the tectonic shift occurring beneath the surface. You have to understand that these miners weren't just desperate gamblers. They were the remote, exhausted workers for a hungry East Coast economy. Through the mud and the madness, they managed to do something miraculous. They established the first global financial bridge. Using the newly formed express companies like Wells Fargo and Adams Express, these millionaires in the mud performed a logistical feat that defies logic. They painstakingly packed their raw, hard-won dust into leather pouches, sealed them with wax and hope, and handed them to armed messengers who braved bandits and storms to get that wealth back home. This wasn't just about greed, it was about the invisible threads of love and duty. That gold paid off thousands of family mortgages in New York. It built white-steepled churches in New England. It put shoes on the feet of children who hadn't seen their fathers in years. The gold rush wasn't just a localized slaughterhouse. It was a massive, violent transfer of energy that rebuilt the foundations of the United States. And for those who didn't die, for those who stared into the abyss of the Sierra Nevada and didn't blink, a new kind of human was born. These survivors didn't just pack up and leave when the gold ran dry. They became the architects of a new world. They realized that if they could survive the scurvy, the cholera, and the $100 eggs, they could build anything. They traded their shovels for hammers and their pans for blueprints. From the ashes of the frequent fires that leveled San Francisco, they built a city of stone and iron that would become the jewel of the Pacific. They created the banks, the universities, and the law that would eventually civilize the wild. They were the survivors of an economic war, and their prize wasn't just gold, it was the creation of the modern West. They proved that while the gold rush was designed to bury you, it also provided the raw materials to build a throne. But as the smoke cleared and the frontier was finally tamed, the world forgot the most dangerous lesson of all. The mud of 1849 California has dried up, but the glittering illusion of a shortcut to wealth has simply moved to the glowing screens in your pocket. Look around at the modern digital landscape. The players changed, wearing hoodies instead of canvas trousers, but the game is completely, fundamentally identical to the brutal traps set in the Sierra Nevada mountains. We are still a species obsessed with the intoxicating promise of overnight generational wealth. We are still willingly leaving our rational lives behind, sacrificing our sleep, our relationships, and our mental health to chase a digital manifestation of that heavy yellow rock. Whether it is the frantic trading of volatile cryptocurrencies, the speculative bubble of digital assets, or the endless, exhausting grind of modern hustle culture, the psychological mechanics have not shifted a single inch in over a century and a half. We are still standing waist-deep in a freezing metaphorical river, sifting through the endless noise of the internet, desperately praying to find a golden nugget that will instantly solve all of our deep-seated human anxieties. But you have to remember the true kings of the era. The men who actually walked away with the empires were never the ones panning in the dirt. During a gold rush, the absolute worst thing you can do is mine for gold. The real billionaires of the modern era are the platforms charging you the transaction fees. They are the algorithmic gurus selling you the expensive online course on how to strike it rich. They are the server farms hosting your frantic trades. They are the exact modern reincarnations of Sam Brannan, standing behind a clean, digital wooden counter, happily selling you a virtual pickaxe at an astronomical markup while you exhaust yourself chasing a mathematical phantom. The human condition is locked in a permanent loop of greedy optimism, constantly blinding itself to the predators waiting at the edge of the camp. So the next time you are offered a guaranteed shortcut to a fortune, look very closely at the man making the offer, because he is not selling you gold, he's just selling you a very expensive shovel.